complicated. And I think that becomes then the stuff that influences, because I don't think the seaters are difficult. I think we haven't necessarily applied our minds to progressive ways to teach the stuff.
Well, you are a lone voice in industry on on that opinion about seaters.
So I think the debate with academies, I think, has happened in every company I've worked with. And sort of my caveat to it is always ask yourself, well, what is your strategy? Because when you get into the discussion on whether you are going to set up an academy, it will be, well, how long do I want my learning and development strategy to go? So if we look at some of the benchmarks in South Africa around academies, who were setting up academies since 1994, sometimes before that, you're looking at Hewlett, Sugar and Mondi. They've probably had the oldest academies, and before it became a topical issue. And I think what I've realized with my experience is people can debate it, but I think you've got to ask yourself, is it cost effective? So some very practical and pragmatic questions. Is the cost impact, the people resource aspect of it, and then what is your commitment to putting people through learning and development? And I think if you can answer those three questions, you find yourself at a point where you say, well, there's academies, which is the sort of first prize, but there's also being registered as a service provider for training, which is kind of the next sort of level. There's, do I partner with an academy or an FET, a further education and training college, or do I completely outsource? So I think those would be the four options you're always faced with, but looking at it in the context of what is your learning and development strategy. And I think that what I've learned is, and from the brands I've learned with, is that they've taken a step back and said learning and development is our sustainability and our retention strategy. So we want to be in the pharmacy business, or we want to be in the bread making business, we want to be in the tobacco business. What will keep us in business? Good salespeople are going to keep us in business. Good store managers are going to keep us in business. So you immediately know that you want sustainability, you've identified the positions, and therefore you know that you will always be spending money on that skill set. So immediately you get the first answer to your question, that to do a completely outsourced strategy is probably going to cost you more. Yes, you can partner, so partnering becomes something different, where I think most companies start with complete outsourcing, and then they are under pressure from the finance department to say, well, how can you reduce this cost? So if you paid that last year for the course, surely over time the same course becomes less. I think the risks for business with complete outsourced strategy is the debate around intellectual property and who owns it continues. And at some point, the outsourced partner has got the competitive advantage, and they can always take it away and they can start to sell it, and then you aren't their only client. So that becomes your risk, and very often the natural progression is then for a learning and development department to start taking over some of that. So how it starts off is you send people on skills programs, or you send them on a full qualification, and last year you would have, or for 2 years you completely outsourced it, but then you bring it in and you say, actually now in the business we have our own assessors. So you can continue to train, but assessment we'll do. It's a part model. Often what happens with that, qualitatively the learners suffer. The seater starts to have a problem that you're not complying. The service provider will say, well, I don't control a portion of the process. The company will say, I don't control that portion of the process. And eventually you reevaluate and you decide, well, actually we would like to become our own service provider as a company for that portion. So I think the gradual move is always takes you, I think you learn a lot more, I think it's conservative. It's a conservative approach, so the risks are low, because if you find that you're not prepared to invest the resources, the industry is changing and you're not sure where it's going, that becomes the stuff you think about. So I think that it'll always come down to what is going to be the preferred model, but more importantly, the commitment to learning and development. So I think if you take the big companies, and I'm going to use retail as an example, because I think that's where private academies have become, I'd like to say, fashionable. It's because I think retail have realized that it's the same stuff, and it's worth them actually becoming a proper academy. They've got control over the content. They can adapt that content. They've got trainers who, especially if they've been there for a long time, can add value to those processes, and can be easily integrated back into the business. So they can make cross-functional moves to not just stay in training, but be reintegrated only to go back, which adds value to the quality of training you're getting. And I think the South African legislation has actually encouraged companies to register academies. And I think with intention, because of the transformation agenda. I think it's how you view it. So what I would say is, if people look at employment equity, the BBBEE, the skills development, those three pieces of legislation, I think the fundamental supports they have to it are the levies and the grants, mandatory and discretionary. And if you look at the move in discretionary, it serves your purpose if you've got your own academy. The next thing is the tax legislation. So we've had 5 to 8 years where the rebates on skills programs and learnerships are in place. Companies have not actually optimized it, but the ones who have optimized it have seen massive rebates, which impacts the bottom line immediately. So I think if your HR or learning departments are not close to the legislation and how it actually empowers businesses and encourages them to register their own academies, then they wouldn't see the full benefit. It'll also become a hard sell, because if you had to go to business and say, we want 5 million to set up our own academy with our own resources, and we are going to pay for skills programs, and we might get only our mandatory grant back, most senior management teams are going to sit back and say, not a chance. Actually, you're a cost center, and the first place they'll cut will be learning and development. But if you go to them and you say, so we want to do this, it's our investment, and we will try to optimize the rebate system, and we will try to strategically align with mandatory grants and sit with the CETA and say, well, how do we become a serious player in our sector? Because that's where mandatory grants go to. They go to people who are committed long term to the scarce skills. And what you start to see is people who are starting to take their employment equity and BBBEE aspects genuinely seriously, who actually are not saying, oh, I want to do it because I want a better score. They're saying, actually, I am genuinely interested in how I can get Black disabled talent into my business. So I want to start talking about how to leverage an academy to do that, because where the basic education systems and the higher education systems might be failing to provide us with people from designated groups, when you register your own academy, you have leverage to start offering designated groups training as a provider. Because the minute you are registered as an academy, nothing stops you from doing adult basic education, which could be then, in terms of your BBBEE scorecard, a social responsibility, which you get funding for. So I think that there will be, for some businesses, a gradual model. There'll always be 4 options in the kitty that they need to look at. But I think what will impact it is the stability of your HR strategy, and that goes with the stability of HR leadership. So if you have lots of change and uncertainty in that, then an initiative like starting an academy can be one that business just sees as a cost, and you're not going to get right.
Just talking about the academies there, and you're talking about long-term sustainability, and obviously you're talking about something that's quite big in terms of scale. What size of business, in terms of that bigger strategy and that bigger in-house solution that you're talking about, what size of business do you think this starts to make sense, and for what size of business, when they're smaller, does it not make sense?
If I look at a business like Philip Morris, okay, I would never recommend an academy. And the reason I say that is because you're dealing with under 1,000 head count. You're dealing with the manufacturing portion only being under 300, which for me is small. We know that the industry is what we call a stick market, or electronic cigarettes. We know that the raw product is becoming an automated industry. So we know that the learnerships, which are the full qualifications, are in the next 5 years, and we know the landscape is changing, is not going to work for them. However, if you had to say to me, we didn't have electronic cigarettes and the stick market is not moving to Tanzania where it's cheaper, and we were going to do it here, I'd say actually for a labor force of